All right, let's talk about the actual speeches that Cicero makes against Catiline in the Selected Political Speeches book. These are listed as against Lucius Sergius Catilinus, so he uses his full name. And it runs for about 70 or so pages in that book, right? So you need to read all four speeches, but it's important to note the difference between the speeches. These are not all given at the same time, obviously, and they're given to different audiences really for different purposes. The thing that prompted these speeches was Cicero's discovery of Catiline's plan. That he had spies. This seems to have been real kind of cloak and dagger stuff, possibly some pillow talk involved, that mistresses of some of the conspirators, had informed on them. In any case, Cicero comes to knowledge of, what Catiline seems to be planning. He knows that they're amassing what looks like an army out in the countryside. Catiline was still in the city, though. And so Cicero made a plan to confront. So he revealed all of this to the powers that be, specifically to the senators. And then as consul, he could convene a meeting of the Senate, which he did. This is, again, sometime toward the end of the year, in the year 63 BCE. Again, Cicero knows that he's only got a short time, maybe a month or so before his consulship is over. And so with the power of the consulship, he tries to, in a way, manufacture a crisis. He needs there to be a crisis. That's an important point to keep in mind here. The first speech was given before the Senate. Now, you see here in the background of the slide a painting done in the late 19th century by the Italian painter Cesare Maccari. And almost certainly the Senate would not have looked like this. The meeting place would have been a lot more plain. Probably they would have been standing around, maybe a few of them seated. And there would have been a lot more senators. There were several hundred senators. Okay, this looks like, 50 or so men seated there. But what ended up happening is while Cicero was speaking, and by the way, Cicero was only he's 42 years old, right? So he looks a lot older here than he really was. Catiline was probably in his mid to late 40s, and so he looks younger than he probably was here. But according to other accounts, specifically the account of the historian Sallust, during this speech, all of the senators got up and moved away from Catiline, and Catiline was left sitting by himself. So that's what Cesare Maccari is trying to portray here. The speech to the Senate, Catiline was there. We have to recognize what Cicero hoped would happen. He wanted the approval of the Senate. The best visual for Cicero would have been a Senate who backed exactly what he was saying, who took him at his word, who believed that there was a conspiracy, and who supported him in arresting and imprisoning and potentially executing Catiline for rebellion, that Cicero would have looked like a hero. This would have brought him the honor that he felt he deserved. That's not what happened. So those are Cicero's hopes, right? The reality is somewhat different. So if we look at the first speech, and this is just the electronic version of the same text you have in the Penguin edition, but Cicero opens the speech by trying to establish a kind of solidarity with the other senators, okay? He uses words like our and we all the time here, right? In the name of heaven, Catilina, how long do you propose to exploit our patience? Do you really suppose that your lunatic activities are going to escape our retaliation forevermore, right? And then he says, look at, we've got guards at every city gate. We've got patrols ranging over the city, and every loyal citizen is massing together to oppose you in your mad attempt to overthrow the republic. Like, what do you think you're doing? Look, we're all united. This is not exactly true, right? As a novus homo, as we've said, Cicero would not have been respected or possibly even believed by many of the senators who were patricians. And so what you have to kind of envision here in this speech is Cicero using his best rhetorical abilities and then trying to rise to a point where he hopes to hear from the senators words like arrest him, seize him, guards, come take him, or something like that. And it never happens. So he starts, he goes on the offensive immediately. Do you really think that you're going to be able to do anything against Rome? Look, every senator here is determined against you, right? And then, he kind of pauses and expects to hear that, and he gets crickets chirping, right? Nothing happens. And this goes on and on, over and over again. And Cicero tries to redirect. He talks to himself at times. Down here at the bottom of this page, he says, the Senate knows about all these things that you're doing. The consul sees them being done. Now, who's the consul here? It's him. And he's like, I'm not taking action. Why isn't he taking action? Well, he knows that if he does this unilaterally without the support of the Senate, that's not going to be popular, right? Rome is freaked out about executive overreach after the dictatorship of Sulla. They don't like monarchs. They don't like autocracy at all. Even as consul, Cicero is limited in what he can do, and he's limited largely by the fact that he doesn't really have honor, at least not to the same level of many of these other senators, right? And so he's kind of flabbergasted here. And yet this man still lives. He walks right into the Senate. He joins in our national debates, watches and notes and marks down with his gaze each one of us he plots to assassinate, right? And so he's trying to scare them in some way. And none of this stuff works, right? He says at one point, I want to be merciful too, but we've got a real threat here. And then he tries to appeal to history to say, look, stuff like this has happened before, and brave Romans stood up against tyranny and against rebellion and all of that, right? And at one point he gets kind of desperate and he says, all right, Catiline, if you are so intent on having an army out in the countryside and attacking Rome, then go to your army. And that's where he really thinks the senators probably are going to rise up and say, no, don't let him do that. We don't want anybody to attack Rome. But they don't. They don't respond the way he wants them to respond. Okay, over and over and over again. One other point about the first speech before we move on here. This paragraph right here, and I don't know, this is about halfway through the speech. He says, and he's speaking to Catiline directly here, right? He says, and yet, if you did by any chance take fright at my words and decided to go away into banishment, I am well aware that a storm of unpopularity would then fall upon myself. Not perhaps now when the recollection of your crimes is still fresh, but in the years to come. However, I judge that prospect amply worthwhile, provided only that my ruin remains personal to myself and does not at the same time imperil our country. So what does all of that mean? Well, this is something you should probably try to unpack, right? Sulla was hailed as a hero during his dictatorship while he was, undoing all of these reforms. In the years after, he was seen as a tyrant, right? And so Cicero is saying, look, the time tends to weaken memory about what a threat we were facing, and the ones who had to make hard decisions during those times are often scrutinized and even castigated for the decisions that they made. But then you get this Stoic philosophy, right? It's okay, I don't mind if I'm ruined by this, so long as the Republic is preserved. That's Cicero sacrificing himself in Stoic fashion. It should be said that this actually happened. What Cicero is predicting here, and he probably, he was predicting it just flippantly, not expecting that this would actually be the case. He actually was exiled a few years after this for executive overreach in opposing Catiline. Stuff that happened specifically in association with the fourth speech, so we'll have to get to that. The Senate doesn't give him the response he wants. Catiline did, it seems, get worried, about what was happening in Rome, and so he left the city and seems to have gone out to join his army, or at least to plan with others who were in the camp with him. And this gave Cicero an opportunity to really kind of take charge of affairs. And so the second speech is given to the Roman people generally. Now, this is not Cicero's preference, right? He preferred to appeal to the senators, to work through the Senate. He is the champion of traditional values and the traditional way of doing things. But when push came to shove, he was all about gaining honor and kind of pressing home his own advantage here to look like the hero, right? And so he goes to the common public. This probably would have been at a meeting of the Concilium Plebis or the Catiline Council, but other people almost certainly would have been present. In this speech, he first of all sets out to define the enemy. He says, now that they're out of Rome, they are not Romans. They are foreigners. We are fighting a common foe, just like we fought against Hannibal and the Carthaginians, just like we fought against other people. Like, Catiline is no longer a Roman. And then he proceeds to smear his character in the absolute worst way possible, right? He pulls no punches. Let's look at some of the rhetoric of the second speech. And he's just making stuff up here, right? This is what we call invective. This is character assassination. Look at the highlighted part on this page. For imagine every type of criminality and wickedness that you can think of. He, Catiline, has been behind them all. In the whole of Italy, there is not one single, and then he lists every type of unsavory character you can imagine. Poisoner, gladiator. Gladiators, although they were kind of heroes of sport, they often had a bad reputation. They were usually slaves, and sometimes they rebel. They led like slave revolts and things like that. So gladiators didn't have a good reputation. So not one single poisoner, gladiator, robber, assassin, parasite, will forger, cheat, glutton, wastrel, adulterer, prostitute, corrupter of youth, or youth who has been corrupted. Indeed, any nasty individual of any kind who would not be obliged to admit he had been Catiline's intimate. Whenever all through these years there has been a murder, the murderer has been he. Not one single act of filthy lechery has been committed without him being its guiding spirit. Now, is that true? Well, of course not. But Cicero's got the podium. And there's nobody else speaking for Catiline, right? At least not openly at this point. And he's driving home his point to the public, who is less informed than the Senate. This is like a political stump speech in a rural location where people are maybe ill-informed. They're not up on current events, and so he's able to say whatever he wants. The third speech came again to the public after the conspiracy was effectively falling apart. Many people, in fact, it seems the majority of those who initially decided to join Catiline deserted from his army. There had been a few skirmishes. A lot of people, some of the conspirators with Catiline had been captured. Catiline himself was still at large, though he would later die in a small battle. Okay, some say heroically. And so Cicero is triumphant here, but he can't be too triumphant. He has to paint this scenario as a crisis. He has to say this was a really big threat. In fact, Cicero goes even further to say that there has never been a greater threat to Rome itself. And there has never been a greater victory than the one that he personally just accomplished by undoing Catiline. Okay, why does he need that to be the case? Why does he proceed along those rhetorical lines? Well, if he brings Rome through the greatest crisis, and if the source of honor is aiding Rome, winning victories for Rome, right? If Cicero is essentially the greatest commander in all of history, the greatest politician in all of Roman history, well, he then deserves the greatest honor. Okay? And so he has to frame the conspiracy as the greatest threat that Rome has ever faced. And then he proceeds to say, okay, so what does the person who led us through this crisis deserve? And he then suggests all of these, rewards that a victorious commander like that, meaning himself, would be worthy of. Let's look at just a couple of passages from the third speech. He starts out by saying, the gods have blessed you so much, right? The gods must really love you. Oh, and by the way, it is incumbent upon yourselves and your descendants after you to honor also not just the gods, but also the person who, now that Rome is founded and made great, has brought it salvation. Oh, who's he talking about? Yep, that's right. He's talking about himself, okay? Cicero's favorite topic. He says, if I hadn't been so vigilant, you would have all been destroyed. Rome would have been slaughtered, right? I mean, he lays it on really thick here. This one's good. A thanksgiving has been decreed at every place of worship, and do you, citizens, now celebrate these days in the company of your wives and children. Children are nestled all snug in their beds. It's all because of me. You're safe, right? I'm the one who did it. Many honors have been justly and deservedly decreed to the powers of heaven on many occasions, but none more justly than this. I have just won the greatest victory ever, he says. For you have been saved from a miserable and horrible death. You have been saved without slaughter, without bloodshed, and in fact, without an army, without a battle. Now, he's got to be careful here, right? If they're like, well, this was just a few guys like LARPing in the countryside. What are you talking about? Then this wouldn't look very good, okay? What he's saying is, this is the greatest threat we ever faced, and I am so good that I managed to steer us through this without even fighting. Right? You have won the struggle without putting off the garb of peace, with no commander but myself, who am clad in the same peaceful toga as yourselves. I didn't have to put on armor. Right? I am so good. I steered us through this diplomatically. Did people buy this? I don't know. Maybe not so much as Cicero hoped. Okay. And then he says, look, I don't want any triumphs, meaning like a big parade celebrating his accomplishment. I don't want decorations. I don't want statues. Notice that he is suggesting all of these things, by the way, by saying he doesn't want them. I think he wouldn't have objected. I just want you to remember me forever. That's the gist of this, okay? I ask only that this day should never be forgotten. It is inside your hearts that I want to construct and cherish my triumphs and decorations of honor and monuments of glory and insignia of renown. Again, planting in their minds all these things they might do for him because he's done this, right? Finally, last speech. Okay. The fourth speech is back in the Senate. Some of the conspirators had been captured alive, and the Senate was trying to deliberate on what to do with them. Cicero, in order to establish this as the threat he was trying to bill it as, would have needed the Senate to order them executed. Execution was the only proper thing for a crime like treason in the Roman view. There were some senators, specifically those who didn't particularly like Cicero, who may have had a soft spot in their heart for Catiline, thought he got a raw deal. People like Crassus, it seems, was hesitant to do this, and may have planted in other people's minds a suggestion that exile or something like that would be a suitable punishment. In fact, Julius Caesar, who at the time was loyal to Crassus, even brought this up as a possibility. The stakes for Cicero are huge here. He needs the Senate to agree with him that this was a large enough threat that it merited execution for anyone who was involved in this. Okay? And so he tries desperately, without trying to look desperate. That's the funny thing about the fourth speech. He's trying desperately to say, we've got to execute these guys, but he can't say that outright. He's sort of like, well, I don't really care. The Senate can decide what it wants, but let me tell you why they should be executed. And then he also keeps talking about, like, some people were saying, well, if we execute them, then, those who still support them are going to be particularly angry, and that could be a threat to your life, Cicero. Cicero's like, you don't need to worry about me. I'm okay. Again, the Stoic philosophy is coming through there. We already mentioned what happened to Catiline. Does the portrayal of Catiline in these speeches and other sources, is that accurate? Well, probably not. Was Catiline misunderstood? Well, some historians have tried to argue that. Even perhaps some of his contemporaries showed that they didn't agree with Cicero. They didn't think that Catiline was really all that bad by some of the actions they took, like Crassus and Caesar here. Okay. And so the source bias shows us that Catiline was a villain, that Cicero was a hero, but again, Cicero was trying to bill himself as that. Cicero did not get everything he wanted out of this. And he became a rather unpopular figure in Rome in the years after this, even exiled for a couple of years from Rome. He returned somewhat mellowed. He got back to his old fiery self just after the assassination of Julius Caesar, which he himself did not participate in. He wasn't one of the conspirators. But he was opposed to Mark Antony, right, who was the supposed heir apparent of Caesar wanted to be, at least. Cicero gave a series of speeches against Antony, and as a result, Antony's henchmen hunted him down and murdered him. And in fact, there's a story, who knows whether this is actually true, that when they brought Cicero's body in to Antony, that Antony's mistress ran up to Cicero's corpse and grabbed his head and like pulled his tongue out of his mouth and stuck a hat pin through it and said, "Thus dies the offending member." The offending member meaning his tongue. He was a great speaker, and that was the greatest weapon that he wielded. And so we remember Cicero and Catiline largely because of what Cicero said. So it's your task then to interpret this, right? To read this source, to talk about the motivations of Cicero and Catiline. Remember power, remember honor. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions about this or want to discuss it further.